So the topic is implementing Agile development. And I was asked to put this together based on a lot of other stuff I do at McGill University. I teach software engineering to undergraduates. And I was asked to take some of the materials I use there and to prepare a short seminar to introduce people to what is Agile development all about, what is the motivation, and to share a few experience reports about it, some stories about it. Logistically, this takes about 2.5 to 3 hours to go through. So usually I'll ramble on for about an hour, hour and 15 minutes, take a short break, and then wrap it up. So break at about 10:30 if that's okay with you folks. And let's see, so the topic, developing Agile, implementing Agile development. I'll give you a little bit of my background, but you'll get more of it from the stories as we go. So my name is Robert Sabrin. Sabrin is a French-Canadian name. It's hard to pronounce if you're not French. So Sabourin is the proper pronunciation of it. People just call me Rob Sab. And I don't find that insulting or anything. I love it. In fact, it's a nickname I've had since I was a kid. Everyone can pronounce Rob Sab no matter what your background is. So call me Rob Sab. I've been involved in software engineering since the dawn of time. Wrote my first code when I was a kid in high school. Literally a kid in high school, 1972, if you want to date that. It's a long time ago to write code. And back then, we had precious little access to computers. So I had maybe 30 minutes a week that all of us, our whole computer club, could access a computer. So we spent all of our time, all of our free time, as we're doing, our academics and everything, but the free time we spent figuring out how we're going to use that 30 minutes. And we did what you might consider a lot of analysis, review, design, walkthroughs, all sorts of static techniques in software engineering. That was hacking in 1972. It was not like Matthew Roderick in all his movies where you see people hacking into war games, computers, and all these things. It wasn't like that. It wasn't romantic at all. It was very hard work. But the cool thing was, almost every time when we loaded our program into the computer, it actually did what we wanted it to do because we had done so much upfront preparation. But anyhow, that's hacking 1972. I wanted to be a software engineer from a very young age. I was brought up in a family of people who were very technical. My dad was at Northern Telecom doing a lot of technical work in his career. But when I got to university, there was no such a beast as software engineering, not at least at McGill. Maybe if I went to Pittsburgh, to Carnegie Mellon, I might have got a degree. Maybe if I went to Stanford in California, I could have got a degree. But in Montreal, the best I could do was a degree in electrical engineering, further specialized in computers, further specialized in software, which gave me 4 years of math and physics and tons and tons and tons of electronics. So I have a lot of interesting understanding of the electrical world around computers. But in my whole professional career, I only designed one production circuit. But I did one, but that was it. Everything else was software, all software. And just the type of stuff I worked in. So about 5 years electromagnetic analysis CAD/CAM, about 10.5 years multilingual computing, about 3 years medical software. And in all of these spaces, I was exposed to tons and tons and tons of different methods to develop software. And we call these methods life cycle models. So a lot of different methods. And I was actually exposed to over 90 different life cycle models, blood, sweat, and tears from idea to real commercial release software, not just theoretical knowledge. So this is real practical hands-on knowledge. And I became quite expert in this career in life cycle models, especially from the point of view of testing, which I think is an anchor point to life cycle models. And so I decided to become an independent consultant in software engineering, focused mostly on stuff related to life cycle models. Little did I know that the universe of Agile development would engulf software engineering, and a lot of what they're doing is setting up Agile life cycle models. So that's sort of the path I've taken. And I've been coming to UPenn on various assignments since, actually I checked the dates this morning before I came here, since 2006. So this is my 10th anniversary of doing consulting gigs, workshops, courses, seminars, and stuff like that. And one of those consulting gigs was a very thorough audit of the development process for some of the IT projects here. So I did actually have a chance to look under the hood, and it was pretty weird. It was neat though. It was neat because what was cool about this place was that a lot of departments, a lot of teams had their own ways of doing things. And the organizations tried to figure out how we get these disparate teams to collaborate together. And that was an interesting sort of thing about UPenn that maybe you don't see in other places. So, is there a buzz? Sorry? Okay, sorry, I thought I heard a buzz there, just a phone ringing maybe down the hall. My hearing is not all that good. So, let's begin. Why do people care about Agile development? Generally, Agile development is a way to organize your projects, a way to organize your teams, a way to organize your software development efforts or your software integration efforts. And it's a way that addresses certain pain points organizations have. If you're moving from what we call traditional development to Agile development, it's usually because you're trying to resolve some pain point. And with a group this size, I might even ask each one of you, is there any special pain point you feel in your current thing? I don't know if anyone has any pain points right now. Pain point? Anything really painful about software engineering right now? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Share one.
We're not gathering the requirements very much at all. So when I get asked to test, I'm actually then
There you go.
by the developer.
So,
well, what do you want me to design?
this Family Feud says, number one answer, survey says, requirement problems. Right requirements, wrong requirements, right time, nothing's consistent. What I'm testing doesn't match what they developed doesn't match what was required, and all of these things flip-flop over the place. Big pain point. Any other pain points that people are seeing in current methods? You don't have to throw too many at me, just one more, fish for one more, no. Yeah.
It takes so long to deliver a product.
Isn't that beautiful? You hit the second one. Time, and things take a long time to do, or they take a long time to do, or there may be, they take longer than we expected. Perhaps there was a problem with how we projected our work, how we estimated our work. So we have problems, and a lot of the problems are, and that's the survey says the second most popular answer is estimation. Although that relates to time too. Timeliness to delivery, solutions out faster. All of these are problems we see with traditional development projects. And over here, we even have more. We have budgeting concerns here. So cost issues that come up a lot. So budgeting concerns and cross-project interference, which is a UPenn thing that not everybody has, but you guys have this because you have projects that, although all the projects are working to help the university or to help the departments achieve goals, they might be sometimes at cross purposes with other projects when it comes to any piece of software. So we might have to modify something for different reasons to achieve the different goals. So they're stepping on each other's feet and stuff like that. Cross-project interference is nasty. Whatever the set of pain points are, many organizations have felt a lot of pain using traditional methods, and at least in my experience, have had great successes in using Agile methods to resolve some of these problems. So there's some very great success stories. Unfortunately, there's also some very terrible failure stories. So it doesn't solve everything for everybody. The motivations that we see often, I want to be Agile because I want things faster. I want things faster. We want things faster. I want to respond to changing requirements quicker. I want to spend money wisely and be more efficient, minimize rework. If one project changes it for one thing, another project changes for another thing, that's inefficient. Even if both teams are doing exactly the best thing, it's still, there's an inefficiency. So speed, responsiveness, efficiency. Sometimes we have other motivations too that are really kicking in there. For example, turbulence. Turbulence in software engineering is about change. And as you're working on a project, we would say a project is turbulent if there's a lot of change. And the changes are to factors relating to, for example, the business reasons for a project might change. The technology around a project might change. The organizational framework around a project might change. And cultural dimensions of the project might change. as you see these changes are happening dynamically, and they are always happening no matter what your life cycle is, perhaps we want to choose a life cycle model that lets us change without having to throw everything out every time there's a big change. So we have basically context issues related to turbulence. Life cycles. Many times people would like to have what are called incremental iterative development methods. Incremental methods, we're building a bit of software at a time, not the whole thing, a bit at a time. And iterative, we're doing it in a sort of a time-boxed cycle. So we're doing it periodically. And whatever the period is, it depends a lot on your team. You have to figure out what's the best balance for you guys. But I got many of my customers who are doing cycles that are about 3 weeks long. And every 3 weeks, they have a chunk of software which, if they choose to, they could deploy it without any additional software engineering work to production. They don't always, I'm not saying they ship it to production every 3 weeks, but when they have that increment created, no more software engineering work is required. That increment could be deployed to production if they so choose. Many companies don't choose to because they wait for a relevant feature set to be ready to push it out there. But this is beautiful if you want to be able to have users be able to take advantage of a system before every feature is ready. And of course, the traditional methods of development wait for everything to be ready before you deploy it, so you get these huge delays and no one's using it. Yes. What are we delivering? So working code. So motivation. We don't want to deliver sloppy code. We don't want to deliver a test version of a code. We don't want to deliver a beta version of the code. We want to deliver actual working code. We have goals. And somehow, this is a motivation for Agile, somehow we can state our goals as a series of, like a to-do list, a series of items in what's called a product backlog. And this is a list that exists. Whatever form, whatever structure, there's a list, and every item we can ask ourselves the question, should we implement this item? When should we implement this item? We can prioritize by those items and choose subsets of that list to implement. So it's basically a model now of breaking down your goals of the product into a prioritized list of things to do. This, by the way, is hard on some projects. If I was to tell you, for example, our project is to migrate to the next version of Oracle Financials, if I say that to you, that's a pretty big goal, and some people would understand how to do that and could start the project right away. Well, in an Agile world, what you'd want to do is break that down into a whole bunch of smaller goals, a whole bunch of backlog entries, a whole bunch of what we would use the word in software engineering, requirements. Break that down. And then in an Agile world, we realize we don't have to do all of them at once. We can prioritize them and do them in chunks that make sense. So that's the goals, prioritized from a backlog. And the approach that very often we're motivated to achieve this is have a team that's self-organized. Because many organizations are coming to the realization that people matter. Isn't that nice that people matter? And I know at UPenn, by the way, people matter all the time. It's all about people. Everything you see, it oozes people here. It's a people place. Okay, I'm happy about that. Well, Agile development takes advantage of the skills and competencies of the team, and the team self-organizes to figure out how they actually get the tactical job done. So nobody goes and imposes on a team, you must do step A, then step B, then step C, then step D, then do this, then do that. The team self-organizes, and every team has a different group of people with different skills and different experience and different abilities, and they will come up with really cool, often novel ways to get the job done. And that's, in Agile development, that's encouraged. We encourage small teams to self-organize, to optimize their skills and experience to getting the job done. There's a huge benefit of this. Because the team self-organizes based on their skills and competencies, you actually get a lot of buy-in to the development approach. If someone came to you and sort of said, you must do this, you must do that, well, you might be able to do it, but you don't feel an ownership for it. And there's this notion now, if you sort of feel an ownership for your development approach, people tend to have better productivity, more fun doing the work. Certainly, I have more fun if I have a chance to organize my work. If I have to follow someone else's organization, I'm sometimes way out of my comfort zone. Although I can do the job. I'm not saying I can't do the job. So this is self-organized. Where do these methods fit in? I don't want to suggest that Agile methods solve every problem everywhere for everybody. I'm a firm advocate of that line from the Mikado, the punishment should fit the crime. You should choose a method that solves the right problem space. So Agile methods can solve almost any imaginable software engineering problem, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to solve every problem with Agile. So I say you should be able to choose where it fits nicely. In my experience, many organizations have several lifecycle models that they use, and they don't all have to follow under one camp. So Agile methods do fit nicely for product development, especially consumer-driven product development. The consumer market is fickle. Consumers are constantly changing their minds about what they need, what features are important, what characteristics matter. And so for consumer product development, we see today almost everybody is using Agile methodologies for software engineering in consumer product development. In projects like a lot of the infrastructure projects we see here, we see people using Agile development methods, especially for the incremental delivery, because people want to be able to get some of the system up and running sooner, not to wait for the whole thing. And for infrastructure projects, like, for example, migration, people are always joking about mainframes. I don't know if you heard before the class, there was some joking around about mainframes. Well, maybe we want to migrate from a mainframe to a new, different technology and use the cloud, and there's initiatives saying, hey, we're going to be the pen in the cloud or something like that. What's the name of this new initiative? Cloud First? Cloud First, so you sort of feel like you're floating in the air. Life is wonderful, Cloud First. But that's infrastructure. So Agile methods fit nicely into these areas, but don't feel that a move to Agile development forces a project to choose a methodology. I think that you should really evaluate. Would a traditional method help here? Would an Agile method help here? And would another method help here? And there's other methods too. We'll look at a few different choices we have. There's also an issue of readiness. Is your organization ready for an Agile transitions? And this is something that I think is both a success factor in some places and it's sort of a detriment in other places. So if you look at the teams, are your teams organized in such a way that it would fit nicely with Agile development? And traditional organizational structures sometimes have teams based on technical skills and competency. So if your team is, like, let's say all of your superstar testers are in the superstar tester team, all of your superstar business analysts are in the business analyst team, all of your superstar Java programmers are in the Java programmer team, well, that siloed organizational framework might actually make it very awkward to use some Agile methods. Not all Agile methods, but some Agile methods would say, ugh, that organizational framework doesn't work for us. So it makes it difficult to have the team buy-in. I've seen at least one major Agile transition fail because they couldn't break the silos of traditional teams. Now, of course, my advice to them at the end was take advantage of the silos of the digital team. Don't use it against you, and come up with a hybrid model so you'll lose some of the benefits, but you get buy-in from the team. And sometimes buy-in from the team is more important than purity in your Agile. Are individuals ready? Certainly, some software engineering professionals have been doing this stuff for a while. I talked to you about starting programming in 1972, right? So I've been at this for a while. My first commercial release was June the 4th, 1982. I'll never forget that day. June the 4th, 1982 was a fixed delivery date release. We did all sorts of Agile things by 1982, like a long time ago. But basically, if you're looking at everybody has different experience. Some people have been doing 30 years of software development, and they're sort of stuck on their approach, and they have an inertia. and they have an inertia. Maybe I don't have that problem because I've seen so much difference, and I like the variations in things. I like the changing things. But if you've been programming for years and years and years with a certain method, taking this requirement document, doing this analysis, doing this functional specification, doing this coding, doing this testing, that pattern might be what you're really expert in. And so a certain individual who is a real guru at development with that pattern, take them out of their comfort zone, their productivity goes, they might not feel very motivated. So there's a readiness of individuals.
Another thing that I noticed is in my previous organization, they have agile teams based on business, no, not business. It's like you said, JavaScript, testers, and all those things. Right? So they have several teams. Silos. They have several functional teams. No, it's a functional team. Mm-hmm. So they have agile stories. Each team has their own agile story, prioritize the stories, and do the execution. Now, the problem here is cross-dependency. If a team, let's say team A is having some dependency on team B, let's say, okay, so they found out at a later stage that, let's say they found it at a later point of time there is a dependency in that team's functionality. They have to finish their work first before we do something. The problem comes here in that approach. The team A, who is dependent now, have found a dependency on team B. If they go and tell A there's a dependency, right? It's up to the team B to fit in the story in the current sprint. Okay, right. But if they say my sprint is booked, so you have to wait until the future sprint, so the team A is getting impacted. So there's a chain of impact.
Yeah, cross-team interference. So one right. story interferes with another story. Yes.
Right. So there's a chain of impact here. We found that very frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine. That might be related to the point we're talking about organizational readiness. If I can use that to segue my point, that's a beautiful example of an organization that has siloed the work, and instead of creating a small cross-functional team, maybe they had set up their work so that the teams are interfering with each other. Sometimes, by the way, teams interfere with each other because that's the nature of the technology, and so, sometimes agile methodologies don't change that.
All the teams should realize that they're all working towards the same organization, right? There should not be any, the priority is the organizational goals, right? So if the team A is approaching team B, you should try to fit in. It's like you should try to fit in that as much as possible. So simply teams should not be rigid. Has to have some flexibility in order to all of us working together and be successful in the organization.
Yep, if you have common goals, that's true. Sometimes, though, we don't have common goals. We have shared resources with conflicting goals sometimes, and both cases need a resolution. That's why I say that Agile doesn't solve everything for everybody. Sometimes you're in a situation that we got to solve other problems first. But I'll show you about the Scrum framework, and we'll talk about the prioritization as we get to it this morning. But that's an excellent risk there. Organizational risks, multiple teams interfering with each other, dependencies on things. These are all things that we have to be very, very sensitive to in setting up a life cycle model that actually is meaningful in a business organization. If you find that the prioritization of requirements, or of whatever the backlog entries are, stories is a type of backlog entry, if you prioritize that and different teams are prioritizing them with different purposes, they're not in sync. You're working at cross purposes, and no matter what, you're going to run into the class of interference problems which you described. That doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. Sometimes these interference things are actually good because they highlight conflicts. Yeah. Sometimes it's better to know about it than to not know about it. So I can pick up where I left off. So the last one I was saying on this bit was is the team ready? Is the individual ready? And the stuff we're talking about, is the organization ready? In Agile development, generally, we see things that are interesting and are very different. Take people out of their comfort zones. For example, less specialized roles. A traditional software tester moving to Agile might find themselves doing some non-testing jobs, tasks, activities once in a while. A traditional Java programmer might find themselves doing some untraditional Java programming things. A business analyst, a DBA, all the different sort of technical areas, people are going to find that they're not just doing what is the traditional work in that role. So we have basically less specialized roles. I'm not saying that there aren't specialists. We've spent our years building our skills and experience. But when you get to an Agile team, the team is expected to get the job done. And that means that we don't just wait for Fred to do all the testing. Some of the testing might be done by Bill or Joe or Sam and Fred. Now, Fred's a specialist. Fred might do mostly testing. But Fred might also do some stored procedures or some work with the programmers or some design issues, et cetera. So we have the roles are less rigid. And this also takes people out of their comfort zone sometimes. The teams are supposed to be self-organized. As I said, the teams have different skill sets. So if you have 5 different Agile teams, they may have 5 very different ways that they work internal to the team, privately, internal to the team, that's totally different from one team to the other. Externally, when you have many Agile teams together, people try to have a uniform way to sort of coordinate and collaborate. But internal to the team, it's totally up to you. The self-organization, it's actually a cool thing. You can self-organize yourself into very productive and very unproductive things. And when you're self-organized, you're taking advantage of the individual skills. There's a risk in this. What if you have a beautiful skill set and then, just for some reason, accidentally, one of the people in the team wins the state lottery? Pennsylvania has a cool state lottery with big, big prizes, if I'm not mistaken. I certainly think that if someone in your team won the state lottery, they're not going to come into work the next day and share the money with everybody. What they'll probably do is not come to work the next day, and your team is going to be short one person. See, there you go. You have someone who won the state lottery, didn't come back. We used to say the crude thing, like, what if someone got hit by a bus? But we don't say that anymore. Now we say someone won the lottery. And the person doesn't come back. So your team now, because it was self-organized, based on the skills of the people there, the people are different, so their method has to change. And so their productivity probably will go down for a little bit as you adapt to the new people working to get the job done. So you're dependent on the skills of the individuals. So self-organized is beautiful, but there's a risk, right? There's a risk. If someone leaves the team, you have to reorganize. And the role of management, depending what you're starting from, and when I look, it's been a while, I've been looking since 2006 at how software engineering is done at least in IT projects at UPenn. And it looks like mostly managers are acting as facilitators to help teams get things done, which is good. But sometimes I've seen managers who are directive. And if you have a directive management style, that's appropriate for a lot of types of projects. I'm not going to judge anyone, say that's good or bad. But if you're used to a directive style of management, you're going to find that in Agile organizations, people prefer a facilitated style of management, a facilitator. So the coordination is to facilitate the team, not to direct the team. So this, sure?
It is based on the team members of the team. The team members are highly skilled and knowledgeable, then the managers are facilitators. If the team members are less knowledgeable and less skilled, then the managers should be directed.
That's generally, yeah, that's called situational leadership. So you're right. If people don't have any experience doing it for the first couple of things they do, they need direction and guidance. However, in Agile teams, you would usually do that by bringing in a coach, as opposed to micromanaging people. So you're right, though. If it depends on your skills and experience, that's situational leadership, exactly. And that is practiced a lot in Agile teams.
You say that facilitating, a manager facilitating is better leader and helps in the Agile much more than a person who's kind of more of a micromanager.
Well, if someone is very, very directive, they will be out of their comfort zone when they're asked to coordinate projects in an Agile context. I think that's what I see. So it's not, I don't want to judge that as good or as bad, because I think these are great managers and they need to develop management skills to work on these type of projects. They don't necessarily magically have the skills. And so someone who's from an organization that has like a PMO, and the PMO's directive is how to run projects, and they're very, very specific about how you manage the steps of a project. Those managers sometimes are very directive. They'll tell you, and with good reason. It's not a bad thing to be directive, but then they jump into an Agile team, and you say, take the same person and give them a role. In an Agile team, the coordinator is called a Scrum Master often. So ask a project manager to become a Scrum Master is a totally different mindset. It's not, and again, but we can learn that, and people very often have the competency to do it, but it takes people sometimes out of their comfort zone. So we're talking about, readiness. So the role of the manager changes quite a bit. In Agile development, that sometimes we do have to have direction, and I'm not saying you totally eliminate the possibility of micromanagement, but it's certainly discouraged. You were going to ask a question?
So when you talk about self-organized teams,
Yep.
Is that more about the group, the team is deciding how to divide up responsibilities, or like I'm not sure I'm completely understanding what you mean by self-organized?
Excellent. So a small group of people is put together as an Agile team. Usually the size of them, in my experience, about 5, 6 people to about 10, 12 people. That's that number of people. So it's not 1,000 people. It's a small cluster, and their job is to fulfill requirements for some specific technology or project or something like that. How they go from a requirement to working code, they organize themselves to do that. So do they have to write a design document, or do they just make a picture on a whiteboard? Does Fred do this job and Bill do that job? How do we check in code in the build server? All of these type of things are the steps that you go through for software development. The team will figure that out themselves, and we usually encourage teams to set up a method that really matches nicely with their skill set as a team. So any two teams would have a different way they practice the day-by-day activities of software development within the team. So that's what I mean. It's that level of self-organization. Outside of the team that fulfilling the work, you probably have a lot of organization that the team doesn't have a choice in. Like, who decides the priority of the requirements? The team doesn't do that. The team sort of gets the priorities from outside. But once I have a requirement to fulfill, how you fulfill it, teams are encouraged to self-organize.
Will you be talking about gathering requirements in an Agile fashion?
A bit today. It's a bit, yeah. It's part of the description of Scrum, and I'll be glad to elaborate more if there's. I can ramble on a lot about this. I promise this though to you, because there's such a vast topic, and there's very little time today. So I don't want to sort of say this is in scope and out of scope. Instead, what I want to offer you is this: is that if you want more information, I'll pass you a business card at the end of the day. Just send me an email, and I'll send you a link to a Dropbox, which has lots and lots of additional materials that complements this. And I'd be willing to any questions you have, I'd be willing to point you to the right direction. I can't say I have all the answers. My experience is, even though it's vast, it's still limited. So I don't have all the answers, but I certainly have access to a lot of information and resources that I could point you to. So if you're interested specifically in like the issue of how do you run a requirement elicitation meeting in Agile, that's called a grooming session. I have actually collaboration stories of that, where what we do is we do, just like this is being videoed as we're talking, I will video the meeting that's going on. I will get it professionally transcribed, and then I will sanitize it, protect the innocent and make sure that you can't tell the company, and then I will share it with you. I have actual transcripts of meetings where people elicit requirements in an Agile context. So I can get very deep in answering that question. What I'd like to do is, today I'll go to a certain depth, and then I'll share with you examples and case studies that will complement that. But it's a beautiful subject, and that's a very important topic, so we will dive into it a bit today. So roles, right? Roles.
I have one more thing.
On the roles?
Go ahead. So when it comes to sprint ceremonies like pre-grooming, grooming, lessons learned, and all those things, we found that in our reality, a lot of time spent on meetings and Scrum ceremonies, a lot of time spent on Scrum ceremonies, which has some degree of frustration for the actual code developers.
So
We don't have after they attend all
That's
these
right.
Scrum ceremonies.
in every Agile method has a certain amount of principles and a certain amount of rituals. And certainly some of these rituals people would interpret as, gee, there's an awful lot of meetings and why should I be here? And there's certainly that, I've seen that issue. That's a risk. We didn't look at Scrum yet, so when I get to the Scrum picture, I'll point those out and we'll talk about them in a little more depth. So, customer feedback changes. We generally will change a little bit of how we get customer feedback. I want the team to get as close as they can to the customer, often talking directly to customers or advocates of the customers or representatives of the customers. But instead of the customers being isolated by these sort of specialized business analyst departments and the team just getting the resulting requirement documents, in Agile we try to foster the relationship as direct as we can between the team and the customer. And this, of course, takes people out of their comfort zone sometimes. Sometimes you want that shield around you because every time you talk to the customer, they seem to tell you to do something different, right? So then we talked about organization. A lot of people like the idea with customer feedback, so we get products into the customer quickly. So we don't wait until the end of the whole project, but after every iteration, we have a candidate that we could share with the customers, which gives us a chance to get feedback from them before the whole project is finished. So this is what we call a Deming cycle. Edward Deming is a quality control guru who developed a method called PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. That's called the Deming cycle. And the whole idea with the Deming cycle is that you want to get feedback and then adapt what you're doing and how you're doing it based on feedback. So in Agile development, we try to get feedback quickly from customers. Even in the sprint when we're developing software, we'll encourage people, like I will encourage a programmer to mock up several prototypes of a GUI and then get a few user candidates to come in and critique it before it's even coded. So this is encouraged in Agile development. It's not an independent team that's doing we're the human factors GUI department and we do all that before it gets anywhere near development. I'm not saying, by the way, there's no role for human factors GUI departments. If I have one, I'll use it any day. But for me, it'll be more a service to my team than a process step in my workflow. Successful Agile implementations that I've worked with solve a business problem. So we're not just doing Agile for the sake of Agile. I have never seen an Agile organization which had a goal saying we want to do good Agile. I've never seen that. So that's something that maybe if you go to an Agile conference, you might get a lot of people saying that's bad Agile, that's good Agile, you can do better Agile. But the business goal is not to do Agile development. The business goal is to do the business. And so successful implementations, we're solving business problems. There's clear ownership. The ownership issue is very, very important. Who prioritizes the requirements? If it's vague, if it's some sort of committee, if it's the prioritization requirements is sort of a weird process like I see, I don't know, in hospitals. You ever work in a hospital? Look at how a requirement is prioritized in a hospital. There's committees they set up, and it's based on doctors' tenure, how they decide to prioritize things. And I don't get it. I just was like, what? Shouldn't you base it on the criticality of the injury you're solving or something like that? And well, they have a method. They have a method that for whatever, hundreds of years, hospitals have figured this out, and that's how they make decisions. Universities also have interesting and strange ways to make decisions. And I'm not sure exactly the structure at UPenn, but I'm from McGill University, and I'm an adjunct professor at McGill University, so I actually get in there every year and do real stuff as a teacher. And I feel that every department has its own like, little kingdom, and no one can tell them what to do. They try to influence them to do things, but you can't force things upon people. So basically, when there's clear ownership for the prioritization of your requirements mostly, you have, I think, a great chance of success. If this is vague, awkward, no matter how well you do Scrum, you might not succeed. And the last one for successful implementations that I see is when it comes from a grassroots initiative. And this is something beautiful over here. I was here on Monday and Tuesday of this week. I was teaching a workshop to an actual upcoming Scrum team. And there were 16 people in the class. And they were all trying to figure out how to get going, how to start working in Scrum. They had a lot of real cool common goals. They were all really already knew each other very well. And they were trying to figure out how do we do it. It was the team that was trying to figure out how should we go to Scrum, what tools should we use. They were looking at tools like Jira, and they were looking at build servers, and like Jenkins and stuff like that. But they were really, you can see that they were sort of empowered to figure out how can we do this. It wasn't thrust upon them. There was a grassroots initiative there. So that's just a pain, right? The pain points. Resolving pain points. When did this Agile movement start? I said my first commercial release was June the 4th, 1982. I said it was a fixed delivery date release, and it was a very important fixed delivery date release, and it sort of changed my life. It was a graphics package, which actually was a windowing system that worked on bus-mounted cards on PDP-11 mini computers. This all is technical buzzwords. You probably have never heard these words, but this was like modern graphic software done in 1982. So these boards cost tens of thousands of dollars. It wasn't like today where you get one for $50 at the store. And the graphics we used was very low resolution compared to what we had, and very slow compared to what's around today. But still, it was working, and it was really cool. And to do that project at a fixed delivery date, we had to use methods that were iterative and incremental. We didn't have a name for it. We didn't have a guidebook to tell us what it was, but we did builds, and we kept adding features to the build, and we did a lot of regression testing to make sure we didn't break things. And eventually we got to the point where we had a product, and we were ready to ship it, and we shipped it. Now, people ask me, why was it a fixed delivery date? And I got married on June the 5th, 1982. So the reason I remember this so well is not because that date is etched into my memory. It's because I got married the day after the release, and the reason the release was fixed delivery was because I was going to be gone. The team was gone, and I was doing everything, like requirements, testing, design. We didn't have software engineering roles back then. It's like no one knew how to set up a testing department or write even a test case back then. It was an interesting time. So for years, people have been doing type of development which is iterative and incremental. Now, come around the year 2000, and two major groups wrote scathing reports of the state of the software development world. One group is known as the Standish Group. One group is, I believe, the Gartner Group. I'm not sure the names of these two huge market research organizations. Their statements around the year 2000 were that software projects were almost all failing. They studied lots and lots of projects, and they found 80% plus of software projects were failing for the exact reasons that people mentioned in this room earlier today. Requirements and estimation. Those are the two top reasons projects were failing. And at the time, if you go through the history of investment capital in the modern world, history of investment capital, you'll see that it wasn't millions of dollars, and it wasn't billions of dollars. It was actually trillions of dollars that was being invested in software development projects at the time. NASDAQ was in a heyday. People were throwing money at software development projects. But 80% of them were failing. 80% were failing. How could this be? Why are investors so foolish to throw money at failing things? Of course, people would argue the risk. If it succeeds, we could make a huge money, right? So this is the risk-reward thing in the stock market. I'm not going to argue with the economics of it, but it was a very delicate and bad time in the software industry. So a lot of practitioners, though, in fact, I think it was 17 practitioners, who were into iterative incremental methods, who have been doing them for years, lightweight incremental methods, were generally successful. My projects were almost always on time. I didn't see a lot of failed projects in my career. I saw some, but not 80%, no. Maybe 10%, 80%, that's absurd. I wasn't seeing that myself. And many other people weren't seeing that because they were practicing iterative incremental methods. So 17 guys got together, and they went on a peer conference at a ski resort called, I believe it's called Snowbird in Utah. This was in February of 2001. These 17 people got together and they did what's called an affinity analysis. Affinity analysis of their different methods, Now I know personally, a good friend of mine is one of the people there, was Brian Merrick. I know other people who I've met since then, many people who have been there, but also I knew other people who were invited there that couldn't make it for different reasons. So I was in touch with that community quite a bit. And they were doing an affinity analysis, just exactly like you would learn if you were watching the children's television workshop TV show Sesame Street. And the affinity workshop, the analysis they did was to compare the methods and say what things are like each other. So one of these things doesn't belong, and 3 of these things belong together, that sort of analysis. And they were trying to compare and contrast their different methods to find out, are there core practices, are there core principles, are there core elements of these things that we can teach people to do in software engineering so that the industry can stop having this terrible rap of 80% plus software projects failing. And they did. And they spent several days, and they looked deeply at the different methods that they had, and they came up with an interesting conclusion. And the conclusion was that there were some common core values that these methods almost all held, and that they felt any method should encourage, so that you have on time, on budget, on quality software development consistently, not just as a rare thing. And they documented it in the style, as is the habit in America, of a very philosophical founding document. So this is a philosophical founding document, and they named it the Agile Manifesto. In fact, when they left that meeting, this is legendary here. They left the meeting, they agreed so much with everything, but they still couldn't agree and still don't agree with the correct pronunciation of the word agile. Is it agile or agile? So I just take a French spin on it. I said it could also be agile. So we have a lot of different ways we can pronounce that word. But nonetheless, they wrote this. This is the actual text of the manifesto that came out of that meeting. And it's only 4 bullet points. So just to all of you who are concerned about how pure your agile is, if you conform to these 4 points, you can argue that you're agile, because this is what the manifesto says. So we're uncovering better ways to develop software by doing it and helping others do it. And through this work, we've come to value individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following to a plan. And that is that while there's value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So it's a bit philosophical, but that's what they came up with. That's the 4 points. So today, if your method, whatever it is, conforms to those 4 points, you could argue that you're doing agile development. Now this, of course, each point here has its controversies. Individuals' interactions over process and tools, this makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of effort in agile development to make sure that we can collaborate with other people to get our job done without setting up inordinate bureaucracies. You try to set up light, effective collaboration methods and approaches without heavy bureaucracies. A bureaucracy might be, I have to make a requisition to get a user to come and see me for a half an hour. In an agile team, you want to go and talk to the user, can you come for a half an hour? And the user comes. Well, maybe that's not possible because the users are actually working, doing their job. And if the user is working, doing their job, well, maybe they need a heads up. So your light process might be your Scrum Master, your facilitator, after your planning meeting, your facilitator goes and coordinates with the user department to make sure that during your development cycle, users are available to provide feedback to the team. So you have a light, non-bureaucratic, effective process. So we see a lot of emphasis on people, working with people to get the job done, and less on the basic bureaucracies of things. This is, in my experience, the most controversial point in agile development. Some people misinterpret this point and feel that agile development is a license to not document software. This is not true. There's nothing in Agile development that says do not document software. A very famous Agile practitioner called Scott Ambler wrote a beautiful book called Agile Modeling, where he describes over 40 commonly used Agile documentation, Agile software engineering documents. And I love the fact that he calls them commonly used. And I challenge almost anybody in software development to name over 5 different types of software engineering documents, because it's quite challenging for even a software practitioner who's been doing it for years. So there's a lot of different documents done in Agile, but this thing is, the goal is not to get the documentation done. The goal is to get the software working. So what the teams try to do is to create enough documentation to collaborate and to get their job done. But no documentation just for the sake of documentation. So this of course, if you're a tester and you start on an Agile team, people don't have any, like, where's my traditional test plan? Where's my traditional requirement document? Where's my traditional this? And some of them are not there. It doesn't mean you don't have them. It means you need some sort of, the team has to self-organize and figure out what is our reasonable documentation level that we need. So it's not no documents. And I've seen the mistake made in Agile transitions where people are starting from a waterfall model, a method that has lots of documentation, and they decide, oh, we're just going to shred everything. We don't need all this documentation. And all of a sudden now you're working way out of your comfort zone and no one's collaborating and no one's coordinating. Well, probably you need some of that documentation, not all of it, and enough to collaborate and get the job done. So I'm always worried when people just sort of cut it all out. I would, if you have documentation now, I would cut it out maybe progressively, some parts of it that aren't useful, parts of it that it takes a long time to maintain and you never read it, that sort of stuff. Documentation for the sake of documentation is probably not worth it, but there's a lot of documentation still needed in software engineering projects. And my example with Scott Ambler, he really does describe over 40 different commonly used types of documents. Now, they're not maybe the same documents you see in a waterfall project. Maybe some of them are tables and mind maps and Gherkin scripts and different types of things like that, but they're still documents. So this is not a license to stop documentation. Yeah. Please, whichever, start in the back there. And then.
Do you find, though, that it becomes a problem for organizations that are highly audited or regulated where they have to provide these documents for regulatory or compliance purposes?
First of all, that's an excellent question. For the question of what about documentation that's required for regulatory compliance? If your team has to document things for regulatory compliance, then when they organize their work, they'll organize to document it for regulatory requirements. Now, regulators like Sarbanes-Oxley or the FDA or some other organizations like that, CSA, ISO, organizations like that, they generally need evidence of your work. And so your documentation will be to provide evidence of what you did. And certainly, it is very important that if you're doing development, no matter what the life cycle is, if you have a regulatory compliance, part of the way you do the work is to create the evidence you need for the people who are the auditors. And if that means creating a stack of papers, well, that's part of the work you do, is to create that stack of papers because they need it for compliance. And if you don't comply, you can't sell your product or you can't use your product or you can't have people integrate the product. Even today, you think these compliance people are all these auditors from Sarbanes-Oxley or government agencies and stuff like that. Well, some of the worst ones today are from big companies like Apple. And Apple refuses to let you put an app on the Apple Store unless you comply to a huge complicated standard and provide evidence to them that you did. And that involves documentation for compliance to Apple's policy. And this is, of course, rigorously upheld by Apple because they believe that there has to be consistency between their products. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I don't want to judge that. But that's an example of that document is required as part of it, so you create it as part of the work of the team. And that's definitely very important. Agile teams will often create a checklist, which they'll call a done checklist. They'll agree with their stakeholders what that is. And in your case, the case of regulatory compliance, in that checklist, usually you will have the list that said we documented according to whatever the standard is. And it's not done unless we have that evidence. So you were going to comment?
Yes, I'm not just a tester, I'm a functional manager. And the second that we have a problem with a piece of software, you know, people are screaming for documents. It is highly, I feel very, very schizoid. I've also been told that one of the things I'm supposed to do is not just document everything that we have, but redocument it all in another template at the same time learning Agile. So, yeah.
You're going to have a lot of fun. So I'll share with you a Dropbox. Send me an email after the class. I'll send you a link to Dropbox. I have tons of stuff which are examples of Agile documentation. And you're not alone. So there's many people that have to go through the pain. The painful thing is that people are asking you for documents, are asking for documents. They're not asking you to help solve their problem. And maybe the document is not the way to solve their problem. The worst case I've ever seen was just north of Boston. This is the worst I've ever seen, just north of Boston. A testing team which they were spending 80% of their time doing the type of documentation that you just described. 80% of their time. So 20% actually testing, 80% of their time doing this documentation. And when I started looking at the documentation, it was, first of all, it was an absurd level of detail where everything was, it was almost like this replicates that, but cross-references that. And it was really what you call and I don't want to sound obtuse on a video recording, but it's cover your butt type of paperwork. Now, I went to the president of the company because I was trying to figure out how to help them do work. And some of the stuff what was helping them with was to get into some sort of more agile way of developing software. I didn't want to say following any specific method because then whatever it is going to be hybrid. I mean, they hired people from the School of Library Science to work on the testing team because they were good at indexing documentation. Think about that. And the people in the testing team, thought that was testing. They never had any reference outside to compare themselves to. So they thought they were testing. It was an amazing, really weird situation. And it wasn't that long ago, by the way. It wasn't like 25 years ago. It's like not that long ago. So what it turns out, the president I asked him, do you have to do this level of documentation because of compliance, because of some space agency thing, because military software? I thought some customers were aerospace. I thought aerospace, big on paperwork. And he said to me, clearly, he said, never in the history of this company have we ever had a customer who required any documentation of any of the testing we ever did. So that wasn't the issue. Then I looked deeper, and I found through history, there was a historic reason, the testing team actually started off in the help desk world. And the testing team wasn't really a testing team, it was a help desk team, historically. And the help desk team had a bad relationship with the programming team for various reasons at the time, which may or may not have existed when I was there, but historically they were there. So whenever a help desk request came in from a customer, the help desk team would go and talk to the developers. The developers would say, hey, what's going on here? And they were so annoyed by these interruptions all the time, they just basically asked back, hey, didn't you test that? Didn't you test it? So eventually it came to the point the programmers would not address the issue unless the help desk people could show how the testing related to that, what happened. And so you're looking now, even though it was terrible. It was terrible. This was awful what was going on. And they didn't know better, so they started documenting everything, relating everything to everything, and that's what the habit they got in. And after years, this became an inertia, and people were asking not how's the project going, but where's this document, or where's that document? And it's true that they became that. And this was a document production team. It was an amazing thing. So I got in there and I tried to help them. It took a long time, maybe 3 years it took to fix this completely, but they had to get to the point of doing a testing team which documents their testing instead of a documentation team that does a little testing on the side. And the development team had to be trained that if there's a problem from the field, I don't care if you test it or not, it's a problem from the field. Let's work together with people, maybe from testing groups, to help get the job done. So in the case I'm talking about, this is an amazing story. It's complex, a little bit because it was in Boston, and there was a lot of these librarians available. You don't know how many librarians are on the market right now. Go to the School of Library Science. Do you have one here? Many universities have a School of Library Science, and Drexel has one. So if you go to Drexel, you'll find there's a lot of graduates that are looking for work. Google is putting librarians out of work, so hire them into your testing team, and suddenly you got well-documented testing. So that example is just to point out that we can do it. It takes time. And sometimes the question you're asked is not help me solve a problem, it's where's this paperwork? And Agile leans more towards let's solve the problem, and once in a while we'll document it. And I think teams should document stuff like FAQs, frequently asked questions, workarounds for problems. Of course we should document stuff, but we shouldn't just document for the sake of documentation or for this sort of CYA, and some people call it traceability. It's like they hide behind that word, traceability. You ever heard the term traceability? Well, sometimes it's basically, I don't want to get blamed for something. So I'm tracing because I'm going to blame the guy who wrote the design. I'm tracing because I'm going to blame the guy who wrote the requirements. You can throw something in if you want.
I was just thinking about it. So like what Lisa was saying, that some documentation, the organizational internal problems, right? In the process-oriented problems. Like that, when there are situations like that, generally there will be an agile coach who will be authoritative and
Help you, yeah.
changing the gears of the organization.
Exactly. So this is part of Agile transitions, is to have people who can catch those things and help you, exactly. But this is, again, when I say this is the most controversial one I see, this is exactly why. And auditory compliance and all this stuff is a big issue. So we do still need to document to comply to whatever regulations. The regulators aren't going to change just because we said we're using an Agile method. This one, collaboration over contract negotiation, is historic. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but back in 2000, because of all these problems with failed projects, what some people did was they made contracts with their customers and they handcuffed them to the requirement list and penalized them if the requirements changed. So you actually had penalty clauses in contracts if the customer changed the requirements. Many times customers did not change the requirement because they didn't want to cause a penalty, but that actually wasn't solving the software engineering problem. That was solving the we're late problem, but you were delivering something they didn't need in the end. So this was thank God I don't see this very much anymore, but at one time this was silly. Responding to change, we're following a plan. In Agile, there's this acknowledgement that detailed planning very far out is not necessarily a very productive thing. Anyone in software engineering who's tried to plan a project beyond about 4 weeks has noted that what's happening in week 5 is probably science fiction. Because usually in software engineering, and I believe this to be consistent with my experience, what I do next depends on the results of what I did before. So if I try to detail plan everything out, I'm going to spend my whole life updating this plan constantly. So it's sort of funny for the people in the PMO who want us to maintain these detailed Gantt charts. It's science fiction. It's not true. But we can, in a short time horizon, for relatively small chunks of work, brilliantly organize it. This is an amazing thing. That if you take a small group of things, 2 or 3 requirements, over 2 or 3 weeks, you can actually get a small self-organized team to be really good at doing them very predictably. But what's the first thing I do the next week? I have no idea. So this is a truth in software engineering. They came back from that ski trip. It's like, the funny thing is, of course, there's all sorts of religious metaphors you can come up with and cultural metaphors because this all took place in Utah, and they're coming off of the mountain with the commandments, and there's all these sort of metaphors that I do not want to get into because they're culturally insensitive, and I just find it hilarious that they did this in Utah. And I love Utah. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say any anti-Utah thing, but they came up with a whole bunch of principles. So after they finished the manifesto, they put it online. Still to this day, you can sign up and sign the manifesto if you so choose. But they found there were some other principles that were not covered by those 4 bullets. So they added these 12 Agile principles to complement them. Now, I'm just going to point out a few elements of these because we looked in pretty good detail at the 4 points at the beginning. This complements it, and this group that does this now is known as the Agile Alliance, and they're sort of the guardians of the Agile Manifesto, And as I said, you can still go online and actually sign the manifesto and say, I support these principles, which is cool if you like doing that type of thing. So these are 12 principles they complemented the 4 points with. So they say satisfy customer through continuous delivery. So we said that, right? Not just one delivery, but many deliveries. Continuous, I don't know if every time I have a piece of software I want to deploy it, but I want to be able to deploy it. We welcome changing requirements, so we have someone who prioritizes that list. And we expect it to change. We expect the priorities to change. We expect people to add things to that list and take things off the list. We expect things to bubble up and bubble down, which is a relief for anybody who's used to traditional waterfall development and the requirements change. It's very painful. Well, in Agile development, we sort of expect that's going to happen. This is deliver working software in short periods of time, as short as my record, 9 months elapsed weekly increments, which is exhausting. I do not recommend that to anybody. I think a nice pace is 3 weeks. I think when you start, 3 weeks is a good starting point. If you find that that's too long, tighten up to 2 weeks. If you find it's a bit too short, stretch it to 4 weeks and get to a candor that makes sense. So we say business people work together with the developers. Yes, we know this is the collaboration point. Motivated individuals, when I said the grassroots initiative, people are motivated, it's more likely to succeed. If it's imposed on people, there's a lot of risks that it will fail. This is an interesting Agile point. They encourage face-to-face conversation. Almost all of the early Agile methodologies, including Scrum, by the way, were designed for a small group of people to work in a small closed space. In fact, this room here is almost the perfect size for a small Scrum team. You might have 7 or 8 developers or testers, all the people in here, and they'd have little cubes in here and a couple of whiteboards and servers, and that's where they'd work. Unfortunately, the real world today is people are distributed all over the place. Try to get a meeting room in this campus to give a seminar, and you end up in an apartment building. Don't tell me it doesn't happen. So we're basically, we're faced with people who are going to be distributed. I had someone in the Scrum team yesterday who was actually from California, if I'm not mistaken. So we have distributed teams, not just physically in this building, but across the world. And this principle's tricky. This whole idea of face-to-face conversation being the best one is tricky. But if you interpret it a little bit, it means that we don't want to send a memo to someone, ask them to write a report so I can give them some feedback. You just talk about it. And we use the most direct mechanisms we can. Today, wide use of screen sharing technologies, WebEx type technologies, Skype type of technologies, that's widely used. And for some reason, messaging with tools like Slack, if you're familiar with Slack, Slack channels, people are just communicating with these tools to facilitate their collaboration. It's not physically face-to-face, but it's as close as you get to face-to-face. Let's see, measuring working software. So this is, of course, an Agile principle. We want to look at when something is done, is it ready? And there's none of this percent done stuff. There's no, this feature is 43% done, 49% done, 52% done, 52.1% done. It's basically done or not done. And we have very crisp definitions of that. And then we count working software. So we look at how much working software is done. And teams will do what are called burn down charts, talking about how they do the work, burn down charts. And glad to share lots of stuff about that. But that's we care about working software. We report outside when a feature is working. We're not reporting or tracking your traditional bug lists and percent done stuff like a waterfall project would. Sustainable development, this is important. Sustainable development means that we don't burn out the team just because we're doing Agile development. So imagine you have one person who is a tester / functional manager in the team, and they're doing a lot of the testing / functional management stuff, and guess what? The last 2 days of every single iteration, they're working like 48 hours a day to get the job done. Heroic efforts like that are sometimes required in software engineering. But if you have to do that every single iteration, you are going to burn out your team. You're going to burn out your individuals. People are not going to be able to sustain it. So you'll get a couple of good sprints, and then it'll flatline. People are going to slow down. People are not going to be able to get the job done. So the idea is to try to self-organize to avoid that, to avoid the work, to set up a work breakdown so you don't have to do that. Agile teams have a beautiful opportunity to change technically how they do their job. In fact, at the end of every iteration, teams have retrospectives where they look at how they do things and try to innovate. So not just change how their process, but also the tools and methods. Agile teams emphasize solving only the problems they need to at the time, so there's not a lot of upfront architecture, a lot less than traditional development. This is where you get the huge pain points for projects at places like UPenn. Because UPenn has so many systems that interact with so many other systems that there's actually a history of architecture here, and that's one that's probably not going to be able to be broken by an Agile transition, so you're going to have trade-offs. You're going to have to say, we do have more upfront architecture maybe than the other Agile teams, but still, that's you guys. So they say the best architectures emerge from self-organized teams. That's called emergent architecture, and that sounds really funny, right? How could a team discover the architecture after they wrote the code? But that is actually what a lot of Agile teams try to do. They do it by what's called refactoring and analyzing. So they add new feature, then they look carefully at the code to see if they could generalize it after they wrote it. So instead of doing big architecture up front, you do a little bit of architecture every feature. So again, that's going to be a hard one here because of so many systems interacting with so many systems. And this is the retrospective, the last thing we reflect. It is strongly encouraged that Agile teams at the end of every single iteration of development have a retrospective to look at how they can do things better or differently in the future, and it becomes part of the practice. And I love that in Agile development. In traditional development, I've seen cases where you might wait 8 months for a retrospective, and you know what, I can write the report right now. The report says we should do more unit testing, and that doesn't help anybody very much. Where in Agile teams, you do the retrospective quite frequently, and when you're doing that frequent retrospective, you get a chance to make the change like the next sprint. You don't have to wait for a big project to take place. Agile development is viewed upon in many different ways by many different people, and I have seen transitions that start at a golf course. And at the golf course, stakeholders get together and they brag about what they're doing, and they brag about how they're doing great software at company A and not company B. And they sort of say, hey, you should do Agile development. So the boss, the director, comes down, gets to work the next week after this golf course, and he says, okay, team, we're going to go Agile because everyone else has gone Agile. I don't know if that's a great motivation to go Agile, but that's where sometimes it starts, top down, with no real reason except that everyone else is doing it and it sounds better. Now, it's terrible when you see that. Sometimes there's a view that when we're doing Agile development, it's going to make things better because the team is going to be able to slice and dice our projects, somehow contort things, our developers are going to become contortionists, and we can fit something magically into short increments of development. So this is the contortionist view of Agile. I prescribe to the graceful view, and this week is Thanksgiving week in Canada. I'm from Montreal, Canada. It's Thanksgiving. Monday was Thanksgiving. Not one person came and said Happy Thanksgiving to me. But I didn't eat turkey. I didn't eat turkey either. So I usually get 2 Thanksgiving dinners a year, so I'm okay. I'm okay. But up north of Montreal, around Thanksgiving this time of year, I like to go to the Laurentian Mountains, and I try to have what I call a Zen experience. I basically become one with the environment, and it's so beautiful. We have the forests there, and there's the leaves changing colors, and it's sort of beautiful. There's a sort of a scent in the air, and it's of course it's cold, so you can see your breath, and you sort of hear the crackles of branches and things. And as I'm standing there, very often, I will hear a sound, whoosh, whoosh. And then looking off into the horizon, what do I see way in the horizon? I see the tail, the back end of a deer. And that deer, when I look at the ground and look at the path it took, it jumped over huge boulders, stumps, branches, ravines, hills, dales, everything you can imagine, zigzagging over broken branches and leaves. And it did all that whoosh like that. That deer achieved its goal with great velocity, overcoming all the obstacles in its path, hardly interfering with the environment at all. That's grace. That's agility. To me, agile teams are teams that can gracefully overcome obstacles to achieve their goals with great velocity without interfering too much with all those other projects that are going on at the same time. So if you look at, interestingly enough, if you look at dictionary definitions about agility, there's actually both views. An agile team is a flexible team, but an agile team is a graceful team. So I lean towards, let's be graceful. That's my Canadian jumping out at me.